So, as I think introduced, I work for the London Legacy Development Corporation. My background is in architecture, but I work both as part of the development team, but also with our planning team as well. And we'll get into some of the intricacies of top-down and bottom-up. I'm sure that'll be a bit of a theme of the day, because here we are in Stratford, in East London, and as you can see, we had a lot of top-down planning to deliver the Olympics. Huge investment in the Lower Lee Valley, huge opportunity, and the LLDC is in charge of a wider area than just the park. So we are now a landowner, a developer, a planning authority, an estates and park manager, but also a regeneration agency, so a facilitator and an events promoter, so we run activities on the park as well. So kind of trying to fulfill all those roles and balancing all those roles is really interesting internally, challenging ourselves all the time, and comes, with positive opportunities and also, trying to communicate that to communities often comes with a lot of difficulties. Here we are, we span 4 borough boundaries, so some Hackney, some Tower Hamlets, quite a lot of Newham and a little bit of Waltham Forest. They were 4 of the 6 host boroughs of the Games. And the park is the central section there, so we've got 560 acres of parkland. But as you can see, that sort of is just one piece of the puzzle. And within that parkland, for some of you, just to help orientate who might know a little bit about the site, that we have quite a number of key venues, including the Orbit, which has a slide now, so what do you want? And the London Aquatic Centre, the stadium, the Copper Box, which has got London Lions basketball and other events, medium-sized events venue. Here East, which I'll come back to, and the Velo Park and the Tennis and Hockey Centre in the north. So kind of quite a unique park environment. So this is going back to before LLDC. The Olympic Delivery Authority delivered the Games themselves. We came and took over to really take forward what was promised after the Games. We were set up in 2011, so before the Games even started, but equally after a lot of those infrastructure and initial planning decisions had already been taken. This is some of the site. It was, it did have some really interesting industry there, but also it had been underinvested in for 100 years or more, and did have a lot of kind of underutilized space and a lot of unloved space. In particular, I think one of the great things that it did achieve was huge amounts of heavily contaminated land, power cables, that the Olympic investment was able to transform that and bring about a new park which acts as that framework catalyst, I suppose, in which to hang a new piece of city, and also solving, what makes places unloved and sometimes a bit dangerous is kind of poor connectivity, and that's something we continue to try and work on as we stitch it back into the city. This I'll touch over quickly, but just to say also some of that rationale was embedded in a theme of convergence, which I think is a difficult word to understand, but essentially, the boroughs that we're dealing with, that underinvestment in East London, and the fact that we were looking at some of the most deprived boroughs in England. And the opportunity, I think, is just the Olympics was already part of this opportunity of identifying that London was moving eastwards. That's where there was this latent space, and that not just around our site, but around the whole Thames corridor, that 25% of London's growth is still likely to be housed in the area over the next 20 years. So the Olympic Park being one of those anchors for that. And here, I think just always interesting for those urban planner type is the kind of morphology of London, that you can see that really development, around the parks really always skipped over this Lower Lee Valley section, and that it was always lacking in connectivity. And this is a well-loved slide in our team of that previously one of the things being tried to fix, that it was a bit of a gap in London's fabric. The Olympic site is around here, given that you had the Lee River, which connects down to the Thames. So here we are, part of the park in 2017, and we have many visitors anticipated. That after the Games, the first 18 months was really just about transforming the park from a Games venue with lots of temporary uses back into a park with toilets and cafes and facilities that you need to manage and open a park. And also the later conversion of the big of stadium and other facilities. But how can we make this park for East London and for the communities that already existed around it? Interesting, I suppose, putting that bit on this bit of the presentation, but just that it embedded in all of the opening of the venues and the games that always local workforce targets have been really, really strict. That even goes for Westfield Shopping Centre and all those big big anchors that really trying to encourage and make sure that local opportunities are there. And this is about programming the park, that the park was always planned for significant new housing growth around it, but in those first years, you want a safe and active place. You actually have quite a low catchment area relative to others, say the other royal parks, which might be double this, so that it's one of the reasons why LLDC is so heavily involved in events programming and activating the park in its early years to make sure that that life is kind of embedded from day one, when you've actually got quite a lot of development platforms and still tricky links. So here we are. We touching on, I guess, the grit of some of the development coming forward. We own quite a lot of land in this area that goes beyond the park edges, and we have significant new housing and development underway on the park itself. So highlighted in the red are some of the new housing neighbourhoods that are currently on site, and in the hatched colour, which is really faint, which probably should be one of the most important, one of the much brighter colours, is the new culture and education district. So I'll just touch over these just to give the stats before we zoom into a local area. Here east is the former Press and Broadcast Centre, and that's had I think someone's described it as, Ollie Wainwright described it as neon Pompidou, that had a new makeover and is a home of, it's got an amazing dance studio, Studio Wayne McGregor, it's got a data centre, it's got Loughborough University have moved in there. There's about 1,500 people working in there now. It's going to go up to about 5,000 in the next couple of years. So that's a real new innovative business cluster, but quite high end, but has some artists and cheaper space in it. We've got just north of the Athletes Village, which was converted after the games, we've got 826 new homes at Chobham Manor. First phase, people are moving in, and lots of family housing there, just below the velodrome. Eastwick and Sweetwater is just coming on site. That's 1,500 new homes. So all of these, as with other parks in cities, you front parks with housing. So all of this was built into what was promised during the games. So we're now busy delivering that, and new schools as well. And then critically, one of the later pieces that's come on board and is still very much in design is partnership with the V&A and Sadler's Wells and the University of the Arts London and in UCL to deliver a big, I suppose the nearest comparison is a bit of a new South Bank on Stratford, alongside housing, which was always promised with the games. So we're kind of intensifying further that mix of uses. But the bit I want to touch on a bit more, and I think will come really, is more relevant for the discussion point today, is as a planning authority, we also have a remit to create new neighbourhood centres. So at Hackney Wick, Pudding Mill and Bromley by Bay. And so this is really those new neighbourhoods that I spoke about. It was always about connecting those back into the existing communities, and that those new neighbourhood centres, so you didn't have isolated communities that didn't connect into what was existing. And that comes alongside with, I think about 30 bridges were put in during the games, but there's another wider drive to deliver new connections, new transport infrastructure upgrades across those areas around the park. And that's all about creating, as I say, stitching back into London. So this is the old Olympic diagram feeding out into the city, which feels a bit historic now. So here I'm going to touch on Hackney Wick and Fish Island, which I think is particularly interesting. And the approach of valuing what is there. I think a lot of on the park, that the need to remediate the rivers, and create that Olympic opportunity meant there was a lot swept away. But in the edges, value what is there, create an interesting mix, learn from what's there, improve that connectivity, and still and further improve that green infrastructure. So the Lower Lee Valley is actually a really special place, has really beautiful moments, has really calm spaces within it. You know, it's beyond the kind of Olympic, beyond the hype of the big venues, and that it was always a space where anything can happen. So how can we, in this quite high pressure environment, bring through some of those qualities that people who are there now and working love about this place? And that we see it's already a really productive place, but often that productivity is really hidden, and I'll come back to that. And also what we inherit is there's been piecemeal residential development, but often, and this sits alongside the industrial development, and poorly resolved with poor connectivity. So one of the things we did was extend the conservation areas in Hackney Wick and Fish Island with our planning colleagues. They're not the big fancy mill buildings of the north, but they're kind of post-war consumer age manufacturing, really exciting innovations, petrol, matchbox cars, perforated toilet paper, all sorts of things, sweets and kind of smaller manufacturing was really created along this Lower Lee Valley corridor. And now those buildings are inhabited a lot by artists, so how this kind of continued innovation, so trying to also preserve that social history within those buildings and trying to make sure that they are kept for workspace use and not converted to luxury flats. So some of the actions, delivery of early public realm schemes even before the park was open, testing and supporting some of these ideas, and how can that feed into our master planning and policy development, and steering through the fact that we have our own local plan and planning powers. So this was a study, and everything underpinned by research. So one of the studies from 2010, I think, before I was part of this story, was, as I say, it was very hidden, the artistic uses in Hackney Wick and Fish Island. So an audit suddenly said, wow, there's 600 artist studios, and each of them could have up to 6 artists in them. So you're talking about one of the highest concentrations of artists in Europe. And this sort of starts to make people think, okay, we can't maybe sweep everything away here like we've done on the other side of the Olympic fence, that actually Hackney Wick and Fish Island has a lot of special qualities, and what makes these businesses tick. But also huge housing growth and commercial space is coming in. So how can we make sure, as this pre-planned master planning, these promises of the games of development and new mixed use can also cater for emerging trends. The fact that a lot of industrial space, you're close to the city, it's not about those really big shed industrial uses, but things that need to be within a certain radius or location, food and drink enterprise, and with all of those big new institutions coming in that I spoke about, the V&A and all the work at Here East, the spin-off of those, and all the universities that are now studying this place and the piece of city. What does it mean for new workspace for those types of users? So delivery of early schemes, we in this area, for example, renovated the White Building, working with Space Studios to create an arts and technology program and centre. So we supported them with programming and rental of a small number of studios, really to give, at that time there wasn't that active face to really show what was going on in the area. Now I think it's really obvious when you go around there. It's really kind of come out of its shell, but at that time there was less, I suppose, things to point to about that productivity behind closed doors. So this was a refurb and a rental for 5 years. It's interesting, fascinating coming here, where being able to give the building over and to allow that to develop slowly over time is something I think we struggle to afford in Stratford, but is something that we continue to strive for. So green infrastructure, obviously the big new Olympic Park, but around those edges that actually there's existing green spaces and community spaces that needed enhancing and programming and growing spaces. New connections, this is down at Bow Riverside, new connections and public realm inserted around the park. And making sure we program these spaces so that you learn, getting the community involved, different communities maybe who weren't travelling to these places or mixing particularly well, particularly the existing low-rise residential to the north of that creative community. How can you start to get them mixing together? So as I say, we own land but not a lot of buildings, so being able to use some of these development platforms as skate parks and as other temporary uses, encouraging, obviously, you know, there's always a commercial incentive to just convert things to car parks in the meantime, because that makes you more money. So, you know, then using our other arm as a regeneration agency to make sure that we make sure some of those spaces are doing more. And testing future neighbourhood centre needs, so as part of saying, okay, we need new community facilities, what kind of facilities, what scale, what's going to be their predominant activities. We built and support the management of Hub 67, which is built using leftover cabins from the games, and is acting, as I say, as a new community centre just in Hackney Wick to begin to test what will go into the permanent development coming forward. And we continue all the time. I guess this isn't a linear process when you try and talk about it in a linear fashion, but always doing research about what makes these places successful, what kind of clustering, how do they share facilities for these small-scale manufacturing between themselves, and how can that begin to then inform back into policy. So last couple of minutes, I want to talk about the master plan for the neighbourhood centre. So there's kind of a bit of the puzzle missing in the centre, so Eastwick Sweetwater here, and this central section, which is designated as part of the neighbourhood centre, had a lot of challenges. So we've taken a proactive approach in terms of how that policy is applied here, and we own a small amount of land, so within it. So multiple land ownerships means that if everyone builds to their boundary, you don't get decent public space, you don't get new connecting routes through, and doesn't make the most of those existing heritage fragments and the positive assets such as the canal. 6 key strategies, I'll talk about some of them. So as I say, looking at the heritage, those kind of fragments of buildings that we don't want to knock down, and anchoring, making sure those historic streets are preserved. They're one of the few things that's been a constant, even as the Lee Valley was sort of bombed heavily and just changed heavily over the years around the marshes, but those have always been there. And then inserting new routes so that they can support this increased density, this increased mix of housing and workspace. Making sure there's key kind of clusters as to where certain land uses are put, and kind of the streets open out to create. It's quite a sort of hard, dense place. This isn't a place of big plazas or parks, but equally we need new play space and the like to support all the new homes, and improving access to the canal. As road transportation came in, a lot of these warehouses turned their back on the canal, and we have a continuous towpath on the Olympic Park side. So this is really about active spill-out spaces, just as we tested at the White Building, where you have a cafe and bar overlooking the canal. And workspace being really central. So critical to the policy is no net loss of employment floor space, not just job density, which is traditionally really low in industrial spaces. So as part of the planning application, we have about 35,000 square metres of workspace within this. And we did an audit of all of the existing users, and of that about 8,000 square metres was kind of affordable, vulnerable users that wouldn't be able to keep up with the market. So we've secured that 8,000 square metres at about £8 a square foot, which is cheap for London, as a head lease in perpetuity. So that is built into the viability of the development. New homes, about 850 new homes. I've got 3 more slides. And so that's sort of medium density. We're talking 3 to 8 stories, and very careful where we even pop up above 5-6 stories. So really quite different to what we're seeing over in Stratford, where we have a lot of towers. And that creates this varied townscape, which is sort of calling on where you have surprising mix of big and small in the wider area of Hackney Wick and Fish Island, and carving out space around those old buildings, and there's only 5 taller elements. So this comes along with really strict, we don't own all the land, so we've set, and we're in conservation areas, but that are due for major change, so we've set really strict design codes. We worked with Carricus Fitch Carson and Witherford Watson Mann architects to develop these codes and master plans. And so that results in a series of parameter plans and kind of detailed building-specific design codes that all are tested as a viability model to make sure this workspace and this housing mix can be supported, so developers can't get away with not doing it. So really, yeah, there's kind of a real pattern book and a really detailed approach to how you create different types of workspace on multiple stories, so that you don't just have this pancake of workspace at ground floor, and allow for servicing and access for heavier users. And those kind of creatives are often real maker users, so they need big loading access, and they need decent truck space, which is not always found in these new developments. So 2 slides on just where we are now. The master plan was approved in April of this year, and one of the key first projects is the new overground station, which we're upgrading, and that creates a new north-south route under the railway embankment. So you're essentially creating a new public access. At the moment, it's very confusing which way you're turning, which way the park is, and it's quite convoluted. You have to go down and round along the canal to get to a lot of the homes, which isn't particularly safe in the evenings. So this really tees up a kind of new pedestrian spine through Hackney Wick and sort of threads it through the area. And that's the land we own, and that we've, with the boroughs, engaged, there's a dedicated on-the-ground business and development manager, so she's engaging with to provide opportunities for those developers, because it's not just us, it's a lot of third-party development as well, to make sure that existing users have opportunities within their new developments. And that I think that's really critical, because everything is changing at once. I suppose huge amounts of development come forward in a short space of time, and to try and retain as many of the existing users as possible. And that once the station's complete, we will be delivering on our land. So that's what I'm working on at the moment, and that's Hackney Wick. Thank you.